Webinar starting in 3, 2, 1. Start.
Oh. Good afternoon, everyone. There are more than 100 people in the room now. May we request everyone to refer to the slide for your consent. The participants' consent. Please note that your participation in this event means granting ASILT your permission to be part of the following: the recording of this event, photos and videos that may be used in ASILT's official website, social media platforms, and the ASILT forum, and other ASILT-initiated research and publications. Please feel free to leave the room if you do not wish to grant your permission. Thank you. Some reminders: please keep your microphone on mute unless you are asked to share later. Please use the raise hand button if you need to share something. And please use the chat box for your comments and questions. It's 3:01, so I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's begin with a short prayer to be led by Ms. Janea Gutierrez from the British Council Philippines.
Good afternoon, everyone. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. We thank you, Lord, for gathering us here today to learn from each other so we can be better teachers for our learners. We thank you for the gift of knowledge and experience that you have bestowed to our panelists and for their generosity to share this with us as well. We ask for your blessings to keep us all safe and healthy so we can continue to do our mission to educate the children and youth of the Philippines. We bring this all up to you in your great glory. And in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Ms. Janea, for that. Good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome to the first of the 3 webinars in this series brought to you by the Ateneo Center for English Language Teaching. And with me is Ms. Vicky Calderon of ASILT. And this is also, hi, Ms. Vicky, in collaboration with the British Council Philippines. And hopefully Mr. Mike Cabigon will be able to join us later. You might want to greet everyone in your own language. Please use the chat box. Mr. Andy Milner, our speaker for today, will also be introduced formally later. We might want to say hi to everyone. Sir Andy.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to be with you. I'm looking forward to the afternoon.
Thank you so much. So we're seeing all of your greetings in the chat box. Good afternoon, magandang hapon, maulan na hapon. Depende kung nasaan kayo, wherever you are, please stay safe. So this webinar series titled How Language Assessment Works, Unpacking the CEFR in the Context of Teaching English in Multilingual Settings is part of ASILT's mission to upgrade the standards of English language and literature education in the country and its neighboring countries by providing basic and higher education teachers, teacher trainers, and school leaders with programs that are based on contextualized approaches to English language teaching. And these are anchored on current pedagogical issues and developments in the use of English in the country and the region. The first of the three webinars focuses on the introduction to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or CEFR. For this webinar, we have two objectives: to engage everyone, those who are in this room, in a timely discussion on assessing multilingual learners, and also to help language educators and school administrators better understand the role of CFR in light of language assessment. I'm Cecilia A. Suarez, or Cheche, Executive Director of the Ateneo Center for English Language Teaching, or ASELT. I'm your moderator and also a panel member in today's webinar. With me are two well-respected academic leaders and educators here and abroad. I will introduce each of them before their respective turns. So our first panel member is Mr. Andy Milner. Andy has been involved in teaching English for over 30 years, and he has worked in 7 different countries in Europe, in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. Most of his career has been with the British Council as an academic manager, but he has also trained teachers, taught a wide range of courses, and worked as an examiner. As well as an initial certificate in teaching English, Andy has 2 postgraduate diplomas, one in teaching English as a foreign language and one in educational management in TESOL. His areas of expertise are English for adults and high school, academic English, professional English, and exam preparation. Mr. Andy Milner currently works as the Academic Support Manager for the British Council's East Asia Exams teams, advising on the connections between teaching, learning, and assessment. Let us all welcome Mr. Andy Milner, who will give us an introduction to the CEFR. Sir Andy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suarez, and hello, everybody. I need to share my screen, I think. So I will try to do this. See if it works. Is that working? Can you see just the presentation slide, Dr. Suarez? Maybe you can confirm for me.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Right. So I'm here basically to introduce the CFR, and I'm pretty sure that many of you will know a little bit about it. So please bear with me and with the people who may be less familiar with it. So in this presentation, I'm going to explore the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, Learning, Teaching, and Assessment. And as you can see from its full title, it is a reference and it is organized in a framework. And what is important to stress right from the beginning is this framework was developed not only for the purpose of assessment. It is also designed to support learners in their learning journey, as well as teachers in their teaching. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you a brief history and overview, where it came from, why. I'm going to share with you things that you probably know, which is common information about the CFR level system. And then we'll start to look a little bit into supporting details, going a bit deeper into the CFR. And we're going to be honest about some of the challenges, issues, and criticisms of the CFR. But we're also going to try to end on a positive note. It's always good to end on a positive note. And that will be a look at the kind of benefits and impacts and the extent of global recognition for the CEFR as a tool. Okay. Now, in the presentation, and to facilitate this session, there will be some brief pauses where we will invite you to consider and to connect the ideas I'm putting forward with your own teaching context in the Philippines, wherever you are in the Philippines. So please do have a piece of paper and a pencil ready just to jot down some ideas. I'm not going to give you very long, so you're going to have to be ready. Okay, so let's begin. What is it? Where did it come from? And why? Okay, well, it was first published in 2001. And it is basically, to give you a summary, it is a very well-researched and detailed description of real-world language use and communicative competence. The idea was to provide a way for different people doing different jobs in different places to compare levels of user ability in different languages, and to make things like pre-intermediate, intermediate, upper intermediate, which were always very vague terms, to make a level system more transparent and standardized and more meaningful. As well as describing what a speaker can do with a language, it is also incredibly useful for mapping and comparing curriculums, syllabuses, courses, teaching materials, teaching aims, learning aims, also for assessment, both by the teacher but also self-assessment by the, and it's also a framework which more formal summative or proficiency tests can be standardized and controlled in terms of what they're testing and why. So it's very important to understand that the CEFR is not a prescription of language, it is a description. Important fact that it was designed to be able to describe what people can do in any language rather than what they know in in any particular language. So why was the CEFR developed? Well, all through the 80s and 90s, it was clear that the European Union and the Common European Market was leading to an increase in mobility amongst the citizens of Europe for both work purposes, but also for education or any other, maybe even social reasons. So there was a growing need for transparent and transnational standards. There was an emergent need to support a multilingual and multicultural context where people were starting to speak more than one language. It was also developed at the same time or shortly after the arrival of what's called the communicative methodology, which is not really a thinking or an approach, which can include many different methods, but with the key principle being a focus on learning language for the purpose of communication. So this is moving away from grammar translation, from structuralism, and from learning grammar and vocabulary communicate. It was actually starting to teach from the very beginning with the idea of communicating in a language. So what the people behind the Common European Framework hoped to achieve was reflection amongst practitioners, anyone associated with language and language learning and language teaching. And to facilitate communication and provide a common basis or common language for curriculum developments, syllabuses, learning aims, and also, of course, more formal qualifications and exams. And this is why it's become so significant to the work of anybody in the field of language education. And again, just to emphasize this, test makers or testers, it's useful for policymakers, governments, ministries. It's useful for academics, materials writers, teachers, and of course, the learner. So as I said before, we used to use words like beginner or what that meant. What did it mean if a Spanish person said that they were intermediate French? What did it mean to say that you have advanced Spanish? They were largely empty and meaningless labels and could be interpreted in different ways. So the idea was to develop a standard system. Now, just to explain of research, it involved specialists from over 40 countries, and it was tested in multiple languages to make sure that it was relevant to each and every language of Europe, of which there were 47, I think. The organization that kind of funded this or facilitated it was the Council of Europe. And they had a language policy unit, and there improved the quality of communication amongst Europeans of languages. Start their interest because not just in language, but in other areas too. But they recognized and wanted to promote from the very beginning the ideas of plurilingualism, speakers who speak many languages, and multiculturalism. Again, not to make everybody the same, but to be able to describe different cultures and different languages with the same framework. So just for clarification there, plurilingual within the context of the Common European Framework refers to competencies of speakers who are able to use more than one language, while multilingual typically refers to a situation, i.e., the presence of different languages in a given location or geographical area. So that's a very quick introduction to the CFR, what it is, where it came from, why it was formed. And this is where we're going to pause for your reflection. So just 30 seconds of silence. And I'd like you to just think, what thoughts are coming to mind for you? Don't say them, don't put them in the chat, just write them down. Or you can put them in the chat if you wish. But what do you think the context and the need and the purpose of the CFR in Europe, how could that translate to the Philippines, to the ASEAN bloc, or to East Asia more generally? What's similar and what's different? Okay, well, hopefully something came to mind. So let's move on then to some of the more common information. And again, apologies if you already know this, but it's worth starting with the common knowledge before we move to more complex ideas. So I think most people will be aware that the CFR has what's called a global scale. And this is an overview or a summary, usually for external people to understand the proficiency of a particular person or a course or a test. And it's split into 6 levels of proficiency, and they are actually grouped or divided again into 3 broader levels of user. So at the bottom, we have the basic user, somebody who has a minimal use, and that in turn is split into A1 and A2. Then we have the independent user, and traditionally we would call this intermediate or upper intermediate for B2. And then we have the proficient user. This is somebody who really is very comfortable with the language and can use it at a very advanced level. So just to give you a little bit more detail there, what we see and what is useful if we are going to use the global scale is for us, with our students in mind, with our context in mind, is to highlight areas of the text which are particularly pertinent and relevant to our learners or to our aims. And we can do this by going through each of the levels. So we see A2. We want to be sure that our students can understand frequently used expressions, especially in the areas of immediate relevance to them. So this is their basic bioinformation, but it could be about everyday things like shopping or local area or work. Okay, so that is comprehension. And then the next part was can communicate in simple and routine tasks, can describe in simple terms aspects of his or her background, immediate environment, and matters of immediate need. So what we see is, well, let's just look at B2, how it changes. So for when we jump from A2 to B2, we now see, well, now we can understand the main ideas of complex text. And this is both concrete or familiar topics or abstract, more academic perhaps. Okay. And especially if it's within their field of specialization. And this is why B2 kind of corresponds to Cambridge First Certificate in English, or Cambridge First as it's called now, and why it corresponds to 6.5 in IELTS, which is the benchmark typically for entrance to universities or for further study. Because if somebody achieves B2, then we know that they can handle some complex text on abstract topics in their field of speciality. Take it up to C2, and now we see, okay, this is the top level. They can understand with ease practically everything that they hear or read. They can summarize this information. They can reconstruct arguments. They can make a coherent presentation, for example. They can also be spontaneous, very fluent and precise. And they've also reached a level where they can distinguish very fine levels of meaning in idiomatic use, for example, and perhaps in different domains, different genres, complex situations. So real command of language. So what I wanted to point out here was that you can see that there's no reference to present perfect here, or can use articles and prepositions well. It's really not the focus. The focus is very much on how well they can communicate in certain fields, domains, situations. And the focus is on the skills, which are more about comprehension or production or interaction. So we can see a little bit more detail here in another thing, which is what should be well known amongst people, which is the self-assessment grid. And this is a little bit more detailed, and it's broken down into areas. And this is for language users to kind of see where they are, to self-assess where they are and what they need to work on, perhaps. Now, the text is a little bit small there, but my intention is not that you read it, but that you understand how it's laid out. And hopefully you can at least see the categories on the left. So for understanding or comprehension, we have listening and reading. For speaking, it's broken into two. One is production. So this tends to be when we perhaps have some time to plan and present and speak a bit longer. And then there's interaction as well, which is more, involves comprehension, mediation, as well as interaction and production. And then writing, again, is a productive skill, production. Now, behind the global scale and behind the self-assessment grid, there are actually literally dozens of subscales, which all feed up to those overviews. So it's a very detailed and well-researched breakdown of communicative functions. And you can actually download this for free. You can get a big Excel sheet like I did here, and you can filter this massive spreadsheet to get exactly what you want. So if you're interested in a particular level, like A2, in a particular skill or language activity, it's called in CFR, then you can filter it, like, for example, reading comprehension. And then you'll see the names of different scales. So one would be overall comprehension, but then there are other things like reading correspondence, so referring to emails and letters, reading for orientation, so reading like a guide or a manual, reading information for arguments, yes, for information and arguments, so reading reference works and books, textbooks, for example, so on and so forth. And then we can see these can-do descriptors of what people are able to do. So it's not what they know, it's what they can do with a language. Okay, so again, we're going to take 30 seconds, and I'd like you to just reflect, jot down some notes, add to the chat if you'd like to. What thoughts you might have in terms of the global scale, the self-assessment grid, or the detailed descriptors. How might they be used in supporting English language learning, teaching, and assessment in the Philippines, your context, and if you wish, among ASEAN nations or in East Asia? So I will shut up for 30 seconds and let you think about that. Okay, so let's then move to some less common information. And I'm going to describe a little bit how the framework is organized at a lower level as in a kind of a deeper level. So when it comes to considering language proficiency, we talk about general competencies, communicative language competencies, communicative language activities, communicative language strategies, and then also plurilingual and pluricultural competencies. So what do these mean? Well, the general competencies refer to general knowledge, it's called savoir, but also know-how, which is savoir-faire, attitudes and values, but also the ability to learn as well. So as you can see, these are not necessarily linguistically derived. These are broader competencies that support learning. Then we move to language competencies, and here we do have more, obviously the knowledge of the target language, the grammar, the vocabulary, the pronunciation, but not only that, also sociolinguistic knowledge and pragmatics. For example, how to behave in a certain context, how polite or formal to be. So this is register, and thinking about the norms of communication. And then we have language activities. So these are the things that we typically use language for, okay? And how we use it in those situations. So whether it's following a conversation, making an announcement, writing an email, just reading for pleasure, or describing experiences, telling a story, narrating, describing, things like that. And that's important to know because it helps us narrow things down. Strategies, this is where linguistically when we use language, we often need to plan what we want to say, even if it's just for a second. We might wish to clarify. We say something and then we want to then expand to make sure that the person understands. We monitor our own speech and we might go back and repair it. So these are linguistic strategies that aid communication, especially in interaction. And then finally, we have plurilingual and pluricultural competence, which is understanding that there might be different cultural norms and understanding that our communication needs to adjust and adapt so that we can get our message across, perhaps. So this is where it's good to know about, another area in the Philippines, for example, what sort of things they are important to them, what linguistic patterns do they have, etc. So it's quite an interesting area because it's about how we take our schemata and our knowledge from one language and we use it to inform what we're doing in a second or third or fourth language. Because very often we actually rely on what we know in our first language to help inform us about how to behave or what to say or what to do when we're acting in a communicative task that is not in our first language. And of course, this is knowledge and skills across these 5 elements that blended together make up effective communication. Okay, so there are literally dozens of scales that sit beneath these labels between this framework. So it could be reading instructions, or it could be understanding conversation between 2 other people. It could be listening to a sustained monologue or making a sustained monologue. It could be creative writing. It also includes like academic skills, for example, taking notes in lectures, meetings, seminars, asking for clarification, collaborating in a group, processing text in writing. So lots of different functions, strategies, competencies are involved in communication. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested in very young learners, there are scales which have been specifically for young learners, developed specifically for young learners, to take account of things like their limited knowledge about the world, their cognitive stage, perhaps as well, their learning skills, and so on. Okay, so The CFR was originally published in 2001. But it was kind of updated in what's called the companion volume in 2020. And there's a QR code there for you to follow the link and download it for free. And what happened is that they chose to update some of the descriptors. So they gave a little bit more definition about what it meant to be pre-A1 or absolute beginner or very low level A0. They also gave more elaborate descriptions of listening and reading. They also adapted some of the descriptors to make them more gender neutral, more inclusive. And they've also included sign language, for example, as a modality. And they have enriched the description at certain levels and also provided more fully defined plus levels, they're called, which are kind of transitional stages between like A2 and B1. They've added an A2 plus. And this can be very helpful, especially for the intermediate plateau, where learners can feel that they're not making much progress. Okay, they've also added some new scales. They added some more on interaction to recognize the fact that much of our interaction is online, like now. And very importantly is mediation and plurilingual and pluricultural competence. They've added a couple of others about pronunciation. And for sign language, they brought in the whole set of descriptors. And as I said, young learners, sorry, I can't, maybe if I hover, you can see the link. But if you just go to the Council of Europe website, you can find these just by searching. It should be quite easy. Okay, so it's starting to get complex. So I'll give you a chance to sort of reflect on that. And again, take 30 seconds and maybe note down any thoughts or questions or pop them in the chat if you wish. What does this, which of these things, what am I saying that could be more relevant for your context? What might be less relevant in terms of those general competencies, general knowledge, learning ability, learning approach, language competencies, language knowledge, and sociolinguistics, pragmatics as well. The activities, are we teaching the situations and the functions that our young learners will need in the future? Language strategies, do we pay attention to this? Enough attention? And what about the plurilingual aspect? How relevant is this to you in your context? So again, I'll shut up for 30 seconds and let you have a think. Okay. Right. Well, as I promised at the beginning, we're going to have an honest look at some of the criticisms of the CFR. Because like any large-scale academic endeavor, you can't please all the people all the time, as they say. So let's be honest and see what some people say about it. So the first one is it's often criticized not being very user-friendly, very complex. And I have to admit, I mean, I started using the CFR more than 20 years ago when it first came out. It was quite new. And I had to read it because I was involved in a project in the British Council. And I don't think I've ever found a better cure for insomnia than reading the CFR at night. Very difficult to keep your eyes open. And it is quite complex. There's also the question, and this happened to me because at that time I was working in Japan, and the first thing many people say to me, that, but it's European, it's not relevant in this context. And there's also, beyond that, a more sophisticated argument that it still presents a native speaker paradigm for full fluency in the language. There's also and this is very real, I think, the action-oriented approach to teaching, learning, and assessment, whereby we give more agency to the learner and the teacher steps back a little bit. So rather than being the master and the maestro and the guru, we become more of a facilitator for the learning of others. And that can sometimes clash with the educational systems of other cultures. I mean, for example, in my part of the world, the teaching methodology is very much influenced by traditions dating back from Confucianism, where the teacher is supposed to know everything and the learners are supposed to listen to and receive the wisdom. And because the CFR is very communication focused and kind of promotes communicative methods such as task-based learning or project-based learning, and because it also encourages self-assessment and more learner autonomy, it can sometimes be difficult to integrate into other education systems. Finally, there is this idea of teacher proficiency levels and communicative confidence. This may not be such a big issue in the Philippines because the Philippines is blessed with generally good levels of English. But in other countries, this can be problematic because many of the English teachers, their own level of English is actually not very high. So, some responses to these issues. In terms of the complexity, what we often say is that, well, you don't have to read the whole thing to make use of some of the tools and instruments available. So your degree of involvement can vary as a user, but also as an administration or as a government or whatever level. And we see that this complexity in some ways was looked at very deeply in Japan, for example, where they looked at it, they studied it, and they revised it to make their own framework, the CFRJ, which is actually, they feel, much more representative of their context. China's done something similar. Vietnam and Taiwan have gone through a process of, mapping their own systems to it so that there is at least synchronicity. But as I said, for a learner to use learning aims and a self-assessment grid they don't need to understand too much. For teachers to use the descriptors doesn't need that much, etc. This Eurocentricity, fair enough. Native speaker paradigm, fair enough. But at the same time, we have to remember that this was born from a plurilingual and multicultural context. And the focus is on communication. We can use it for any language. And we see that in 2020, with the companion volume, it was updated to put more emphasis on the concept of mediation, which is the idea of maybe translating or interpreting or summarizing or intervening in some way to help speakers of different languages communicate effectively. The transfer of a foreign approach or philosophy of education is difficult, and it requires a lot of investment. And what we recommend at the British Council, of course, is what's called the comprehensive learning system approach, where we pay attention to three interdependent corners of a triangle, where if we're going to change a curriculum, then we have to make sure that our teachers understand how to deliver it. So this is teacher training, communication, and also that the assessment systems are actually assessing what we are aiming to teach. Okay, so again, teachers do need to be supported through this, and there needs to be good communication. So yeah, teacher training is important, and teacher knowledge is also important. Okay, so I'm going to pause again, 30 seconds. In terms of integrating CFR assumptions and principles into your context, what would be the main challenges, or what are the main challenges, and how could those challenges be overcome, you think? And if it helps, I'm going to flip back to the previous slide for you to consider that as a reminder. So what would be the main challenges, and how could those challenges be overcome in integrating CFR into your context? And I'll just leave that there for you. Okay. I think I've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left, if that's right, Cheche. So I'm going to whiz through the next parts. We're going to look at some of the benefits just to finish off the presentation. I'm going to look at the positive impacts. So one of the things that the CFR is very useful for is supporting teachers when looking for teaching learning resources, because they tend to be mapped to the CFR. So this can be course books, but it's also websites. For example, the British Council's website, Teaching English website, where you can get lots of free resources and lesson plans, will be divided up not only by age group, but also CFR level. We also see that AI is familiar, at least, with the Common European Framework. So here's an example of a chat, and I hope you can read that on your screens. But basically, I asked ChatGPT if it understood the CFR, and it said, yes, I have a good understanding. And what it can do is it can tell you how complex a text is. It could also produce a text for you or modify a text for you to make it a certain level. Now, of course, if we remember the garbage in, garbage out principle, we can't always trust ChatGPT to give us a completely accurate. So at the bottom, it always says ChatGPT can make mistakes. Okay, so varying degrees of accuracy, but it is helpful as a guide. Okay, so it does make it easier for teachers to check or create teaching materials at the right level of difficulty. If you are, and by the way, sorry, here's a nice little link to an article, which is an update on how AI is being used in teaching so far. Excellent research, and this is an article based on research, so very easy reading, very informative. But just give you an example, instead of ChatGPT, you can find other tools which their purpose is much more rigorous in the way that they've trained the large language model. And what I see, I was talking to somebody here in Vietnam yesterday who is actually developing his own large language model AI in order to help his students with their IELTS writing and IELTS speaking. It's very complex, but he's just using the data on IELTS to feed and train his AI model. And that's what people in different regions, different countries should be looking at, is to train your AI models with your local version of English. Okay, other positive impacts. This is just an example of a project involving Cambridge, British Council, and University of Bedfordshire. Again, it's a very rigorous look at the grammar, vocabulary used in English mapped to CFR levels. Because remember, the CFR itself does not describe English. It describes communication in languages. But that project does it for English specifically. So the CFR has been positive for syllabus designers and teachers. And part of that is selecting language that can be used. And here's an example from the British Council, where the British Council worked with an organization called Equals. They developed a massive database of information taken from many different sources in the field of English language teaching. And they worked out what topics, what grammar points, what language points, what expressions and phrases are typically taught at the different levels. And so that becomes an inventory. And there's a link there. So that's completely free. You can download that and you can get all kinds of clarity about, if you're using an expression, is it the right level for your student? Or is it too complex or too easy, etc. Other positive impacts include the fact that international exams, especially proficiency exams in English from Cambridge, but even TOEFL from CBT for TOEFL and TOEIC, APTIS, British Council's exam, and IELTS, they're all mapped to the CFR level, which helps to understand if somebody says, oh, I've got this score in TOEFL, IBT, then you can kind of work out where they are. Because as you can see, IELTS has bands. Cambridge has points, so does TOEFL. Then you've got other tests where they might have grades or descriptions, and it's meaningless unless it's kind of a common scale is understood. So you can find these correlation tables easily. So it's very useful that they're all mapped to the CFR. And just to give you an example from British Council, we decided to actually create a test based on the CFR. So we didn't create a test and then map it to the CFR. We actually looked at the CFR, we researched it, and then we made the test based on that. So the marking schemes for the examiners give points according to meeting both quantitative and qualitative criteria within the CFR levels, B1.2, B1.1, A2.2, A2.1. You get a different point for each level of performance. And the functions like describing, giving opinions, providing reasons, explanations, these are all pretty much taken directly from the CFR global scale or self-assessment grid. Okay, so finally, in a more meta sense, the CFR is a common language across borders, okay? So between institutions, between researchers, but also between policymakers, governments, etc. And this has become quite important as English as a subject in basic education starts to transfer into English as a medium of instruction, with the growth of transnational education. All of this, language policies around this region particularly are starting to look to the CFR for support as a way to understand how to align different programs. Okay, so this is happening in the region. Okay, I think I might have gone a little bit over. So I will just summarize. Basically, since it was published, it's been translated into more than 40 languages. It's become very influential for evaluating the language needs of learners and therefore helping us to choose, select, or develop learning materials, produce courses and syllabuses. It can be used for self-assessment, continuous assessment, and summative assessment. It can really help inform teacher training programs because there's a focus on the reason that we're teaching English is for communication purposes and for describing language policies. Okay, so final words. It's a global framework for a globalized world. It's a focus on language for real life communication. It's what you can do, not what you know. It's a recognition of a multi-cultural reality, even within that global world. It's a common language of reference for teaching, learning, and assessment, not just assessment. And we know it's been extensively researched, validated, corroborated over decades. We know that it aligns with more modern language educational practices, can be a challenge. But very importantly, it's free and it's everywhere. So that's the last thing. So final pause, and Cheche, feel free to come back in whenever you feel fit, and apologies if I have gone over.
Thank you so much, Mr. Andy Milner. Can we give him a big round of applause, a virtual round of applause? Thank you so much, Sir Andy.
You're welcome.
I can see some in the chat box, but before we address them, we have another interesting presentation, and this time with Dr. Edison Angeles Fermin. Adaptive, innovative, and resilient education is at the heart of more than 2 decades of his professional and advocacy work. He is the Vice President for Academic Affairs of the National Teachers College, or NTC, an institution managed by the Yuchenko Ayala Human Capital Development Group, iPeople organization. He formerly served Miriam College in various capacities at Innovation Development School Principal. Dr. Edison Fermin holds a bachelor's degree in secondary education, major in English, minor policy, Philippines Diliman. A champion of micro-advancing distance graduate. Recently, his research team was conferred an international research collaboration grant from the British Council to assess the state of English language education in Philippine basic education. And that's what he's going to share with us today. Please welcome Dr. Edison Angeles Fermin.
Good afternoon, Cheche, Andy, and the rest of the British Council team. I'd like to express my warm greetings on behalf of the community of National Teachers College. I could see that there's a number of NTC graduate school students in the chat box. I just wish that you were not forced to attend, but you find this really helpful for your purposes as education specialists. What I'd love to bring to your consciousness, picking up from what our colleague Andy has provided you, is to look now at the relevance of CEFR in the Philippine context. And the way I'd love everyone to appreciate this is that we use CEFR to connect education to future readiness. So that spells CEFR. So remember that because that's my main thesis. But I will try to connect that further to really address how CEFR is crucial to Philippine human capital competitiveness. And before we begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to the British Council in Manila for supporting our research on the scoping study of English as a subject in basic education in the Philippines, completed in 2024, and the other one on English and digital for girls education in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, completed just recently. I'd like to premise the discussion that I will have with you today on these two studies and a very important document of the Philippine government, the Philippine Development Plan. So I split this into 4 parts, given that Cheche gave me the challenging duration of about 15 to 20 minutes. I'll do my best. And so let's begin looking at our multilingual context quickly, the challenges and opportunities before us, and why competitiveness of the Philippine economy and our education sector in particular would be possible because of CEFR. And allow me to articulate our recommendations that have sprung from our research. So remember that this is Southeast Asia's second largest multilingual country, next to Indonesia in terms of linguistic diversity. And the multilingualism that the Philippines enjoys is actually part of our everyday life. You will find yourself in a restaurant or in a classroom where a student begins his or her articulation in Ilocano or in Pangasinense, continues with Cebuano, and then continues with Filipino, and of course, English you will find in the middle of those things. To the dismay of English teachers, they hate what we call our code switching. But to be honest, it's a language learning strategy to begin with. So this thinking that our multilingual context is both a boon and to some people a bane, I think we owe that to our post-colonial linguistic landscape. And up to this day and age, even in the chambers of the House of Representatives and the Senate, they're discussing which language should we really facilitate in our education or prioritize rather in our education system. And this actually has led to many debates that pose a lot of challenges in our language education policy. As some of you may have known, and we cried about this for so long, the MTB-MLE or the Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education Policy has been rescinded. And this is something that we need to be more vigilant on and about, because there is something that we can do to convince legislators or the Department of Education, for that matter, to reconsider the decision. Because as I will discuss later, and as Andy has actually phrased earlier, it is important that we situate a global assessment tool such as the CEFR in light of the plurilingual context. It's not just multilingual that we are dealing with. And for the longest time, we are talking of a context where fragmented language policies are in operation. And the lack of a coherent framework has actually led us, even if Andy believes that the Philippines' case of English proficiency is good, take note, recent international large-scale assessments, such as the PISA, the Southeast Asia Prime Learning Metrics, they're saying otherwise. In fact, even our functional literacy studies will tell us that there seems to be a big question mark, or probably a myth that has surfaced that Filipinos are really good at English. That's something that we have to deal with. And an opportunity has actually come before us thanks to influential agencies such as the British Council, who's now taking the lead in ensuring that we really understand how proficient are Filipinos in terms of English. And as Andy has competently discussed with you, we're dealing with a growing number of framework for multilingual education systems. Institutions present today, if you're thinking of adopting the CEF discussed lengthily and comprehensively by Andy, can be summarized into four. You have the action-oriented approach that is at the heart of the design of the CEFR. It concentrates correctly on plurilingual competence. It's no longer just about your knowledge of the language, it's really our communicative repertoire in various settings. And I very much like when I started studying the CEFR, when it started permeating the ASEAN environment, the can-do descriptors. And you know why this is valuable to outcome-based education, particularly in Philippine higher ed. We need to describe our learners in terms of what they can really do.